When we think of sculpture in a public place, we often imagine a hero on horseback or a statue of a posturing figure. These were the images that were chosen to symbolize the making of contemporary American history. Today's images are different in many ways, yet similarities do exist. We continue to remember our history by commemorating place and purpose, thoughts and ideals.
Why did people settle here? And this is giving a reflection of that moment in time.
So, in a very real sense, the sculpture of Alan Sonfist, Mary Miss, and Richard Serra draws from a tradition based on common experience. That tradition was once limited to heroic statues and later expanded to celebrate ideals and place. With Naked Truth, a nude female symbolizes freedom of the press. Inscriptions honor the city's immigrant heritage through 3 editors of a German-language newspaper. Meeting of the Waters symbolizes the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. The domain of sculpture is space. For centuries, an imposing pedestal separated us from the work. We looked up, read the legend, glanced at the statue's features, and moved on.
I think one of the things that's interested me about doing this kind of sighted work is that rather than it's being an object that you look at, it's something that you walk through and interact with.
In other ways, too, the nature of form and space in sculpture has changed. No longer is the sculpture's core concealed. Interior space plays as crucial a role as the forms that delineate it. Movement plays an important role in sculpture, too. We're invited to enter and move about the sculpture's space. Sometimes the sculpture itself moves. Alexander Calder painted, welded, and riveted sheets of steel to make this mobile sculpture. It, along with Marc de Souvero's suspended form, offer examples of another change in sculpture, that of materials. Heavy building supplies, I-beams, and structural timbers combine in a balance that betrays their massiveness. Stainless steel reflecting subtle variations of light and weather offer a magnetic appeal to Saarinen gateway arch.
You might find that the straightest path through it is not the one that's offered to you for the experience of it. And I think that's really the difference. As soon as you walk into that piece, you realize it's not a mere passage to get from one street to the other.
Richard Serra, Mary Miss, and Alan Sonfist have created works which, in quite different ways, draw on the history of the land of which they are a part and invite us to share that experience.
Coming through the woods and finding this large excavation, I didn't identify it. I didn't know what it was. It turns out that it's the foundation for an old swimming pool that was made to look like a natural pond. So it's this large organic shaped structure. But as far as I was concerned, it was visually a very beautiful thing. The way it integrated with the landscape, it followed the kind of contours of the landscape, but it was open. It didn't have solid growth all through it because of its having this concrete bottom. So I thought, this is really a beautiful structure. If I could, I would love to make something like this, to come in and have this big open space poured. To walk through it is very lovely. It's very shallow at one end and very deep, so you're dropping off, going, following the contour of the land in a way. In addition to the pool, there were these very beautiful old stone walls. The masonry work was very nice. And then also, as I said, there were the concrete foundations of what had been bathhouses and maybe a place to eat, or I'm not quite sure what it was. So I decided that I would build my structures in wood and build my structures to elaborate upon what was here. I liked the idea of it being wood. I wanted them to be like fragments, not that you were seeing a complete work in one spot. I think one of the things that's interested me about doing this kind of sighted work is that rather than it's being an object that you look at, it's something that you walk through and interact with. So to see this work, you have to walk through the whole site. You can't just kind of walk up to the edge and take a look, as you might be tempted to with a statue, and walk away. If you want to see it, you have to go through the whole place. I'm interested in providing experiences of place, of space, making people appreciate the woods in a certain way, of appreciating the structures that they might come across in the woods. But in a way it ends up, it's about people seeing more than they usually see. So in that sense, it's more about reality than fantasy. But at the same time, reality ends up having many layers to it. And it ends up having a potency to it or an emotional content to it. And I'm interested in kind of layering those things up. When I was a kid, we would stop at historical sites that were marked along a highway. And I grew up mostly in the West and Midwest. And I remember all the kids would pile out of the car and we'd go to investigate where Fort such and such had been. And this wasn't Europe, or this wasn't someplace where there was a long history of building within the area. So there would be, maybe some foundations, an old well, a couple of walls, but you never saw a complete major ruin. But this was really interesting to me. They'd be overgrown, and you'd have to kind of walk around them and piece together in your mind what it is you were seeing. And as I was doing that, I can always remember I was putting the pieces together my own way and almost inventing this place for myself. So in a way, that's what I want the viewer to do, not to expect that I've got a specific storyline for them to follow, but let them put the pieces together. So the idea of using structures that have some familiarity is something that I think is interesting. You're drawing upon a vocabulary that people are familiar with, but they take for granted. They don't pay much attention to the locks on a canal or the boat dock on a river or a lake, or what their grandmother's front porch or her trellis over her rose garden might have been like. So I like to bring those images up and focus on them in some way and give them some importance. In this particular piece, I was very interested in the idea of Japanese gardens because you never have the overall view that you might have at Versailles. At least you think you have it at a certain point. As you walk out, you find out that you don't really, but you've got an overview of the place. You can kind of see what the perimeters are. In the Japanese gardens, you're really being taken from place to place, and you're layering experience of place so that it's not all exposed to you at one time. I haven't seen the completed work in the fall or winter, but I saw part of it when the leaves were off the trees, and everything, it takes on a much different character. It's not so much embedded. You begin to see these parts that you weren't aware of before. There are a lot of stairways and walkways going off around the edge of this, and as things die out, they become much more visible. Now, once you get into a city, everything's structured, so you have to start thinking of other things to be layered into it, and introducing a wild element into the city is something that I like to think of doing.
And I thought this might be a nice reflection of the arch as well as the settlers who were coming through here, and this is what they would have observed. They would have observed the actual mounds that would have existed here by the Indians that made up of St. Louis. And then they would have seen this, beautiful virgin timber leading into the prairie, which would be beyond this area. So you will be actually seeing these different layers of time all collaged together, and that's why it is called time landscape. Why did people settle here? And this is giving a reflection of that moment in time. And then obviously surrounding the time landscape of St. Louis is the ongoing construction of the city itself, which is part of the environment for the sculpture. So you are seeing the three layers of time, and also you're seeing the contemporary layer of the city growing around it. Normally people see trees in a city as these what landscapers call as ornamental furniture for the street. They stick in 20-foot trees or 15-foot trees, and they always are equally spaced, and it becomes this ornament for the street. The idea of Versailles was selected because the first European settlers that came to St. Louis were the French, and Versailles itself represents the ultimate in formalized landscaping. So I selected the area, which is actually, it's called the Isle of the Sun, which is a main section of Versailles, and you actually see the cobblestones, which represent the actual rays of the sun that are going out from a central area, which in Versailles itself is actually an open pond. And what I've done is taken that pond and superimposed the actual mound in the central area with the forest on top of it. The actual formal landscape will stay static as it is, because that's what a traditional formal landscape is about. And the trees will reach an idealized height. And my feeling is a young forest is made of contradictions, visual contradictions as well as ecological contradictions. They'll see the visual differences. I mean, from the actual formal evergreen formal landscape to the crushed stone, which is obviously a very textural difference, rising up into a mound structure. But the actual forest in the middle, which is a mixed forest, will have a continuous visual change from a full green to the colors of the fall, to the winter, which will create this very bare forest, to the spring again, which is the birth of the forest. So you'll see the complete cycle. As a child, I was always very close to trees. I mean, intellectually, I know as a child those were fantasies, but in some ways they were realities as well. And I had my favorite tree, and my favorite tree was a tree I talked to.
I think one of the things that's very clear to me when I come here, and every time I fly here, and every time I've been here, and I've been here in the past quite often, is the flatness of St. Louis, and the flatness of the American landscape, and the flatness of the extension of the American landscape in relation to the rivers, in relation to the railroads, that the piece in some sense becomes not a metaphor for the flatness, but reflects upon the flatness. And the piece has a horizontality that bespeaks of that flatness. The shadows make the openings more apparent. Once those shadows just lay flat on the ground and they don't intersect the openings, then the openings become like light wells, and the piece becomes like a light container. So the openings become much more like passages into the light, into and out of the light. Here I really was more concerned with the entire surface of the land, how I feel that the river moves in relation to the frontality of the landscape, how one, if you come to St. Louis, it's very different than coming to other places. There are very few places like it. There really is a big sky that goes over this city, and there really is a big flat extension of the landscape. And I wanted that horizontal expanse to be contained in the piece, and I wanted the subtlety of the movement to be contained in the piece. When I think of Twain, I think of Huckleberry Finn, and I think of passing on the water or passing through the landscape. And I think this piece has a movement through the landscape. So in that sense, it may be a way of identifying, in a very personal sense, my relation to how I think about the writings of Mark Twain. And I also wanted to make a shape that responded to, via its openings, the aspects of the city that I thought were interesting to frame as you walked. When you look through the openings, the horizon then becomes the cross-section of whatever urban fragment is being cut. So you'll either see the horizon as an architectural pediment, or you'll see the horizon as a sculpture that's being framed, or you'll see the horizon of a detail of a car, or you'll see the horizon as an opening to the building. But the horizon becomes your eye level via the opening of the piece into the urban landscape. So it starts to reframe various horizons, not only given to the sculpture itself, but in terms of the city. But it could be seen as a metaphor for framing as a camera frames. It becomes a very interesting perceptual model in order to understand your relation to very simple things: size, space, location. What does it mean when you go from an exterior of a form to an interior form? What does it mean when you round a corner? What does it mean when you walk down a hill 3 feet and the elevation remains similar in terms of height, but your elevation in terms of measure changes? The piece allows you to measure yourself not only against the sculpture, but against the fall of the terrain. There's something very accessible about the piece. If you come to the upside of the piece, you can actually peer over it. Once you walk into it, the elevation rises as you go down the incline, but there's something very human in the accessibility of the scale. It goes from body size to architectural size to ship size to landscape size, and the metaphors start to spin. I think to understand this sculpture and the variety and diversity of experiences that are open, you have to walk, look, reflect, pay attention, possibly leave the piece, come back, walk the entire block, enter into the piece, walk up the field, look at it again, and then you start becoming involved with the language of the work. One of the interesting things that happens around noon with those pieces is that either between 1 or 2 o'clock, the plates reflect themselves, and so the drawing of the top of the plate is reflected on the side wall of the other plate. So there's an internal drawing that goes on in the piece with the shadows making the drawing of the piece on the piece. I think there's one leg of that piece that actually anchors and turns that piece into the ground. And you can say, oh, it's a subtle formal reading, but I think that that reading's open to anyone, because it becomes quite apparent that when you're in the shape, you might think two sides are flat and you're in an equilateral triangle, and as soon as you take 4 steps, one of the whole walls just moves on you. Not only does it close or open, but then it cracks or bends. And I think that bending and that cracking sinks it back into the landscape and actually registers where you are in the location of that landscape. It centers you. You have to walk several yards before you're aware of the fact that what you thought you were looking at is not what you're actually looking at, that what you thought was flat is actually moving at an angle to you, that what you thought was closed is actually open, that what you thought was above you is actually below you. As it goes down the elevation, it sinks into the ground. So it has the movement of a ship as it first enters the water. It has a plowing movement into the earth. That cutting into the ground, or that holding of the space, I think centers the piece. One of the things that I notice when you drive around it is it has this staccato movement of almost a train entering a yard. The opening, if you watch freight cars move by each other, you can often see from freight car through freight car to the other side of the street. As the car moves, the piece opens and closes in a very quick way, as if it was moving while you move. I do think that it's a work of art that particularly brings into question the awareness of the viewer, and that the content becomes the ability of the viewer to walk and look and reflect. You might actually take the reference that you've learned from seeing this piece out into the city at large and re-see the city.
But I like the idea that people can come out here and spend time in this place.
One of the things that's nice about the site, it's totally accessible. And the idea is that there are the pathways that are the formal garden, which brings people right up to the forest, so people will be able to witness and observe native birds.
It's going to provide a space for reflection.
I actually wish more people would use it. I wish performers would use it. I wish composers would use it. I wish they would take the freedom to think that it's theirs to be used.
I love to see people walking around it, kids, like a couple little boys walking around the edge. So the kids can find that this piece is even more embedded in the site than might be immediately obvious.
It's always been the case that the first people to really understand the work are the people who play with it, and it's usually been children.